So why the clip on the Hudson airplane incident? So I think it's important to note that we are not at status quo. We are not at business as usual. We are in an emergency. Okay, your engines are destroyed. You have to react. You have to make decisions, and you have to make them quickly. And this is for the protection of public health. So if you take us back 2 years ago now, right? So back in early 2020, when the Wuhan virus, as it was known then, was then made known that there's this, an infectious disease agent that was out there that was unseen before and of potential high concern. And then nearly exactly 2 years ago, when the first case was detected here in Singapore. Since then, the virus has disrupted lives, caused many hundreds of millions of infections, it's caused millions of deaths, and it's basically destroyed many economies and caused great disruptions to schooling, to our social lives, to the healthcare systems. So with this in mind, people swung into action. The Trump administration started the Operation Warp Speed. We started digging around for prior constructs that we could work with. And the world was really pinning its hopes on vaccines. Now, clearly vaccines are not the only thing that matter in a pandemic. There were many other measures that had to be taken in place prior to the vaccines coming on board, including safe distancing measures and so forth. But vaccines, we knew, was our way out of a pandemic and a return to normalcy of life. And by September of 2020, this is the amount of investment by the various regimes in the United States, in the EU, right across the world, in investing for discovery and development and rollout of vaccines for COVID-19. So with this in mind, we formed back in April of 2020 a therapeutics and vaccines team. So this is led by Professor Benjamin Seat. It brought in clinicians like Professor David Lai, myself. It brought in immunologists, Professor Laurent Rainier and Professor Rennie Chi, and he brought in folk from the Economic Development Board, Dr. Lisa Wee. And so this core team was set about then to meet with companies and to try to bring vaccines in. This was back in April of 2020. And our remit to find safe, effective vaccines and bring them early to Singapore. So the factors, oops, I apologize. Yes, the factors for consideration, we needed to look at the track record of the vaccine platform. For instance, have they been used in the past for development? What's the likelihood, the scientific basis for them to have effectiveness? What was their potential safety profile? We looked at available data and ongoing studies that the companies were putting forward. We also looked at the entity's ability to deliver. So some projects that were put forward to us were by smaller companies and biotechs. Some were by the larger pharma companies. And there were various partnerships that were ongoing for development and manufacturing. So we had to look pretty hard at the ability of these companies to deliver to Singapore. What leverage did Singapore have for early access? For example, for some of the early monoclonal antibodies and small molecule antivirals, because of our strong research capability and clinical trials, we were able to access them for patients for COVID treatment. There's a necessity also to hedge for risk of failure by approaching it through a portfolio angle, meaning that we had to have a diversified approach, taking various platforms and various companies. We also had to consider acceptability to the local population. As you know, there are concerns potentially about whether a vaccine could be halal, for use in our Muslim population. There were concerns about the use of aborted fetal cells in some of the assays, and these were things that we thought pretty hard about. Last but not least, even though we were given the remit basically to pretty much get what we can, we also felt a responsibility to preserve our resources. So with this in mind, this is a sampling of the different companies that were at the point in time involved in vaccines development. This is really only a small sample of the companies that were that we have managed to engage during this period of time, starting from middle of 2020. Over that time, from then till about the end of the year, we probably reached out to about 35 companies and met them individually. So the types of vaccines, I think now is familiar to many of us. At that point, we looked at the inactivated viral vaccines, of which Sinovac and Sinopharm are exemplars. There were the non-replicating viral vector vaccines, of which J&J and AstraZeneca are the commonly seen examples. And then for mRNA, we have Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech, which have been widely deployed. And last but not least, we also look at the protein subunit vaccines, of which Novavax is the latest that have been approved by the WHO. So at this point in time, in September 2020, because of the big R&D efforts and investments that have been put forward, there were hundreds of vaccines in development at the preclinical stage, 21 into phase 1, 13 into phase 2, and then another 10 vaccines which were the front runners in phase 3. So these studies from those in phase 3 were beginning to be read out at this point in September 2020. And these were the sites globally that were involved right across the world, depending on where the outbreaks were. So what does it take for a drug to be approved? So this is the ECTD, or the Common Technical Document, that basically lays out the types of parameters that regulators look at before they would agree to approve a drug. So starting at the bottom, you can see that quality, as pertains to manufacturing and the product specifications, is a key component. We look at the preclinical studies that support the registration, toxicity, safety studies, as well as some efficacy readouts. And then for the clinical, clearly also the most important part, which relates to, again, treatment efficacy, relates to safety, and so forth. And all of this would be bundled upwards and presented to the regulators in a complete dossier for consideration. So I mentioned again, these are again in brief the 3 parameters. The FDA also then issued emergency use authorization for vaccines for COVID-19, a guidance for industry, so that there's no ambiguity, or really to provide the industry with some assurance about what would be a relevant endpoint. And basically, it needed for minimum efficacy demonstration a point estimate at the 50% point, and also the lower bound of the confidence interval needed to exceed 30%. So this is to ensure that we have a high confidence, greater than 90%, that the minimum efficacy of the vaccine is above 30%, right? So with this, we looked at data over a number of companies. This one was published by Pfizer-BioNTech for the BNT162b2. And this is immunogenicity, the early data. We are looking at the 30 microgram dose in the circles, where you're looking at the binding against antigen, as well as the viral neutralization on the bottom panel. And you can see there is a small dose response going up to 30 across 2 different age groups. And then if you look at the far right, it exceeded the convalescent plasma levels. Okay, so we did have, I think at this point, in lieu of actual real-world efficacy data, some indication that this vaccine was able to provide the recipients with the right kind of immune response that would be neutralizing against the virus. This is the safety data for the Pfizer-BioNTech. So as expected for a immunogenic vaccine, there was reactogenicity with regards to pain at the injection site, redness and swelling, and by and large they were mild to moderate in nature with very few severe cases. Similarly, for Moderna, this is data again that looks at binding as well as viral neutralization. And we were comfortable here that similarly there was a dose response going upwards, and we look at the middle there, this is the 100 micrograms. And then finally, from this, as they rolled into their phase 2 and phase 3 studies, sometime in late October is when the studies were completed, and as the results were read out, we look here at the Pfizer efficacy curve over time. And as you see from the left, at the start, we have placebo versus dosing at 30 micrograms. And after 7 days, after 14 days, and so forth, out for several months, you find that it's highly effective in terms of reducing symptomatic infection, over 94%. And similarly, for Moderna, the results, the graphs almost overlay each other. Again, high efficacy. In this case, Moderna, the dosing is at 1 and 28 days intervals. And then, as you see, they begin to separate even early on, before the second dose. And as the second dose is given, the separation goes even higher. So again, greater than 94% vaccine efficacy against symptomatic disease. So who were involved in this? So the Ministry of Health certainly involved in terms of public health measures and the rollout of vaccinations. The Health Sciences Authority for reviewing the vaccines as they came in. The Moderna, Pfizer, and Sinovac are the three currently on our program, and were all reviewed thoroughly by the HSA. And the Economic Development Board that was involved in helping us bring the vaccines into Singapore by engaging with the companies. So, 21st December 2020, over a year ago now, the first batches of Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine arrives in Singapore. And after some checks, senior staff nurse Sarah Lim on the 30th of December receives the first COVID-19 vaccine in Singapore, a landmark occasion for us. So, since then, how has the data shown? So, if you look at the real-world effectiveness information, you looked at the death rates. I just extracted this from the Swiss case. And if you look at the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated rate for deaths, it is many-fold higher in the unvaccinated. This is data up to January 1st, 2020 from Switzerland. Similarly, in the UK, the differentiation across the age groups, you can see that in the higher age groups, the risk for the unvaccinated is many-fold higher than those for the vaccinated. But if there's actually an age-related difference, they are much more vulnerable at the more elderly groups, particularly above the 50s and 60s. Similarly, for Singapore data, this is up to October of last year when we were looking at the rates of the rates of ICU admission of the fully vaccinated versus the unvaccinated, and also for the case of those who have passed away or perished from COVID-19 infections, right, which is actually about 9 times higher. And if you just look at some of this data, this one I pulled off MOH website again. If you look at the Delta wave that hit us back in Q3, Q4 of last year, and if you see that when the infection rate rises, and so I just sort of tracked the dates up to about mid-September, and it continued to rise after this, right? It hit a peak of over 4,000. Is that the ICU rates, admission rates for hospitalization rates and ICU rates for COVID-19 infections actually also followed, right? Now, the other thing to note is that I think there had been some concern about whether or not the vaccinations themselves may cause widespread adverse effects for the general population. So if you take a look at the blue line, which lies flat, so that indicates the non-COVID admissions into ICU over that period of time. And you can see that through that period, prior to September, when our vaccination program was running full speed, into September, it stayed flat, right? So I think here is a good indication that generally the vaccination, which had at a point been given to many millions of Singaporeans, is not contributing to significant medical conditions. On the other hand, COVID, as the cases rise, you can see the light blue line, in fact, does rise in tandem. And it's only when our cases had fallen off towards December that we were able to get a handle on this, and now the rates of ICU admission and hospitalization is back down to a fairly manageable level. So what's different about the current Omicron wave? If you look here, you can see that these are 3 countries, England, France, and Spain. And if you look at the bottom panel, you see that for the adults, the cases versus admissions, basically there's a separation now. okay, in that even though the cases have spiked, the admissions have actually not gone up in tandem. And this is because in these countries, there is a reasonably high rate of vaccination, and that is mitigating against hospitalizations. However, if you look at the top panels for all three countries, is that with the rise in cases, admissions are in fact spiking. And if you look at this is from US data with regards to the ages for COVID-19 associated hospitalizations by ages. And if you look at the 5 to 17 and 0 to 4, is that these are cases because they are mostly in the unvaccinated, they are starting to rise again due to the Omicron wave. We will not downplay the issues that I think cause concern for many of us and many parents around vaccine dosing, coagulopathy, myopericarditis, allergy and anaphylaxis, Guillain-Barré transverse myelitis. These are all known associations, adverse effects with vaccination, rare though they be. And so the challenges for us going forwards. Well, first of all, because the development was in a fairly constrained set in order for it to proceed quickly, we had to expand it out over time for pregnancy, for immunocompromised, and now we're extending it into children, and then subsequently, what's the position on boosters? Another challenge, clearly the virus does not sit still. Omicron has descended upon us, it's now creating a public health issue right across the world. And there's vaccine hesitancy and misinformation. Right. Thankfully, there are people out there who do contribute, and they try to educate in terms of the public knowledge for the issues around vaccine safety and efficacy. So, in closing, deciding which vaccines to bring in and how was a multi-agency, multidisciplinary effort that was predicated on science, operations, partner engagement, commitments of resources and dollars, some level of intelligent risk-taking, and frankly, also a little bit of luck, all right? However, this is really only the start, because since then, there's been a constant ongoing review of data, its expansion, differentiation, and nuancing of use cases, offering choices of vaccines to our population, and also importantly, how to communicate this to the public at large. So with this, we see the vaccines as your umbrella to help us navigate this stormy period, and hopefully we will shortly be out into the sunshine. And with this, I thank you very much.